Take a look at the person sitting across from you, the person who knows your coffee order, the person who has seen you at your weakest and swore they'd never leave. Now ask yourself, how well do you really know them? We all like to think we have an instinct for danger. We think we can spot a liar by the way their eyes shift, or a traitor by the way their voice falters. But the most dangerous people in the world don't look like villains. They look like the husband who brings you flowers. They look like the sister who holds your hand at a funeral. They say betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from an enemy, but that's the first lie they tell you. An enemy is a shark fin in the water. You see the threat and you prepare for the strike. But what do you do when the shark is swimming in your own blood? What do you do when the person who held your hand through the dark is the one who secretly turned out the light? Betrayal isn't a sudden explosion. It's a slow-acting poison. It's a shadow that moves so gradually across the floor of your life that you don't realize you're sitting in the dark until the sun is completely gone. My name is Beverly Carter. They told me I was the anchor of my family. But anchors don't just hold you steady. If the rope is tied to the wrong person, an anchor is just the weight that drags you to the bottom of the sea. Before I tell you how my world turned to ash, I want you to tell me in the comments, have you ever felt that chill in a room? That moment you realize the person smiling at you was wearing a mask? Stick around, because by the end of this, you might just start looking at your own inner circle a little differently. This is how my world stopped turning. For most of my life, I believed I was blessed. Not lucky. Luck is for gamblers. I felt blessed, as if some higher power had looked at the wreckage of my childhood and decided I'd had enough pain. I had a stable job as a senior administrative coordinator, a role that suited my need for order. I had a modest townhouse, a small garden, and what I believed was an unbreakable inner circle. At the absolute center of that circle was my younger sister, Simone. Simone wasn't just my sister. She was my person. We were 14 months apart, close enough to share secrets, clothes, and the kind of inside jokes that only make sense at 3 o'clock in the morning. We were a binary system. I was the brain, cautious, analytical, the kind of woman who triple checks the stove and rereads every line of a contract. Simone was the heart, magnetic, warm, the kind of person who could walk into a room of strangers and leave with 3 new best friends. Growing up, the neighborhood used to say, Beverly is the anchor, but Simone is the sail. Together, we were supposed to be a complete unit. Our childhood was a battlefield. Our father walked out when I was 10, leaving behind a hollow silence and a mountain of debt that broke our mother's spirit. She worked 2 jobs, her face a permanent mask of gray exhaustion. There were months when the electricity got cut off, and we'd sit in the dark with flashlights, pretending we were camping, eating ramen noodles and praying for the sun to come up. During those years, Simone and I clung to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. When I cried silently into my pillow, Simone would crawl into my bed and hold my hand. When she got bullied at school, I stood in front of her like a human shield. We made vows back then, whispered promises in the dark. We'll always protect each other. No matter what happens, it's us against the world. Nothing will ever come between us. I carried those words in my chest like a talisman for 20 years. Then I met Nate. I was 30, and I had almost given up on finding someone steady. I met him at a barbecue, standing awkwardly near the cooler. He wasn't flashy, he was just solid. When I joked about his soda, he laughed a real laugh, the kind that crinkles the eyes. Nate was a listener. He was the man who showed up with a world's best plant mom mug because I'd mentioned once that I kept killing my succulents. To a woman who had spent her whole life being the protector, having someone finally look out for me felt like finally being allowed to breathe. When I introduced him to Simone, my heart was in my throat. Her approval was the final gate. She hugged him like they'd been friends for decades. "Oh, I already love you," she said, beaming at me. "Anyone who makes Beverly smile like this has to be a good man." Nate blushed. I felt a pride so deep it ached. For the next 2 years, the three of us were a tripod. Game nights, Sunday brunches, holiday road trips. Simone joked that Nate was the brother she never had. Nate joked that he finally understood why I was so protective of my baby sister. When Nate proposed, quietly, on our couch, pausing a sitcom to get on one knee, Simone screamed louder than I did. She insisted on helping me plan every detail. "I've been waiting for this my whole life," she told me, clutching my hands. "You're my sister. This is my moment, too." I thought it was the sweetest thing I'd ever heard. I didn't realize she was telling me exactly what she planned to do. Our wedding was beautiful. Simone was my maid of honor, standing right beside me as I swore my life to Nate. Her speech was heartfelt. She talked about how she had always been her North Star. She looked at the crowd and said, "If anyone ever hurts my sister, they'll have to answer to me." The room clapped. Nate squeezed my hand. I looked at my sister and felt a warmth I can't even describe. I believed her. I didn't know that the person I needed protection from was the one standing right behind me, holding my bouquet. The first 2 years of my marriage weren't perfect, but they were solid. Or at least that's the story I told myself every morning while I made the coffee. We had the kind of arguments that felt healthy, the gray problems of a life built together. We argued about Nate's habit of leaving damp towels on the bathroom floor and my insistence on keeping the thermostat at a crisp 68 degrees. It was normal. It was safe. But looking back now, I realized that the air in my home began to change in ways so subtle I would have needed a microscope to see the rot. Nate worked in IT, a job that often required him to be on call. I was a senior admin, which meant my hours were long and predictable. It was a rhythm that worked for us, until the rhythm started to skip a beat. Nate began to spend more time on his phone. He wasn't hiding in the bathroom or locking himself in the office, not at first. He'd just be sitting right there on the couch next to me, the blue light of the screen reflecting in his eyes, his thumbs moving with a frantic, rhythmic speed. When I'd ask who he was talking to, he'd offer a casual, easy smile. Just a group chat with the guys from work, or Simone's having a crisis with her new boss again. I never questioned it. Why would I? Simone was always having a crisis. She was the heart, remember. She felt everything at a volume of 10. I was her anchor. If she was leaning on my husband because I was too busy at work to answer her 5 calls a day, I saw it as a sign of a healthy family. I was glad they were close. I was happy that the man I loved cared about the sister I worshipped. I was a fool. The patterns shifted. Simone started stopping by the house less when I was home. She'd text me saying she was overwhelmed or needed space to find herself after her latest breakup. My heart ached for her. I sent her flowers. I left her long, supportive voicemails. I even told Nate to check in on her if he was near her apartment. "Make sure she's eating," I'd tell him as I kissed him goodbye in the morning. "I'll handle it, Bev," he'd reply, his voice steady as a rock. "You just focus on that big presentation." Then came the Tuesdays. Every Tuesday, I had a late-night board meeting that didn't wrap up until 8 p.m. It became a routine. Nate would stay home, order pizza, and catch up on his gaming. But slowly, the gaming stories started to get vague. When I'd come home, the house would smell faintly of a perfume that wasn't mine, a sweet, floral scent that lingered in the hallway like a ghost. "Did Simone drop by?" I asked one night, sniffing the air. Nate didn't even look up from his laptop. "Yeah, for like 10 minutes. She needed to borrow a screwdriver for a shelf. She didn't stay long." I noticed the pillows on our couch were always slightly rearranged. Not messy, but different. Like someone had been sitting a little too close, trying to make the space look undisturbed after the fact. I noticed that Nate started buying a specific type of craft beer he used to hate, the kind Simone always kept in her fridge. The first real crack in the glass happened on a Tuesday I'll never forget. I came home 2 hours early because the meeting was canceled. I expected the house to be dark, Nate perhaps asleep on the TV. Instead, I heard laughter. It wasn't just any laughter. It was that deep, guttural sound Nate made when he was truly happy, the one I thought was reserved for me. And underneath it, the bright, melodic trill of my sister. I stood in the hallway, my keys still clutched in my hand, and for the first time in my life, my stomach didn't just tighten, it turned cold. I walked into the kitchen. They were standing by the island. There was at least 3 feet of granite between them, but the way they jumped, the way Nate's face from radiant to a sheer panic in half a second told a story that words couldn't hide. "Oh, you're home early," Simone said. Her voice was too high. Her hand went to her throat, a nervous tick I'd seen 1,000 times when we were kids and she'd broken something of our mother's. "Meeting got canceled," I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "What are you guys up to?" "Just talking about her job search," Nate smiled, but it didn't reach his crinkled eyes this time. It was a performer's smile. I looked at the counter. 2 wine glasses, half empty, a bottle of the expensive Cabernet I'd been saving for our anniversary. "Must be a hell of a job search," I remarked, my eyes moving between them. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the kind of silence that has a physical weight, like the air right before a thunderstorm breaks. Simone laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "You know me, Bev. I can't make a life decision without a glass of courage. Anyway, I should be going." She practically ran out the door. Nate didn't follow her, but he watched her leave with an intensity that made my skin crawl. That night, for the first time in 3 years, I didn't want him to touch me. I laid on my side of the bed, staring at the wall, listening to the rhythmic sound of his breathing. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that they were family. I told myself that I was the brain, and the brain sometimes sees patterns where there are only coincidences. But the gray world I had built was starting to bleed, and I had no idea that the man sleeping 3 inches away from me was already dreaming of a life that didn't include me. They say the truth will set you free, but they never tell you that it usually breaks your heart first. A week after the kitchen incident, the air in the house had become thin, like we were living at a high altitude where every breath was a struggle. Nate was on call more than ever, and Simone had gone completely silent. My phone, which usually buzzed with her memes and frantic emergency updates, sat cold and quiet on the nightstand. The first crack didn't come from a dramatic confession. It came from a dead battery. It was a Tuesday, the day that had become the graveyard of my peace. I was trying to send a project update to my team, but my tablet had died, and I'd left my charger at the office. Without thinking, I reached into Nate's nightstand and pulled out his. We didn't have a no devices rule. We were a family. We shared everything. Or so I thought. I swiped the screen. It wasn't locked. Nate always said he was too lazy for passcodes, a trait I used to find charmingly honest. I opened the messaging app to send a quick text to my coworker, but the app didn't open to a new message. It opened to the last conversation he had been having. At the top of the screen was a name I knew as well as my own, Simone. My heart didn't race. It did the opposite. It slowed down until I could hear every individual thud against my ribs. I shouldn't have scrolled. A part of me, the part that still wanted to believe in the blessed life, screamed at me to put the tablet down. But the brain, the analytical coordinator who lived for the truth, took over. I scrolled. It wasn't just a few texts. It was hundreds, a digital monument to a year-long betrayal. There were heart emojis, there were inside jokes about our childhood that I thought belonged only to me and her. But then, the tone shifted from playful to intimate. Nate, I miss you already. The house feels empty the second you walk out that door. Simone, I wish I could have stayed longer, but she'll be home soon. I hate rushing our time. I felt the room start to tilt. I sat down on the edge of the bed, our bed, and kept reading. I was like a person watching a car crash in slow motion, unable to look away even as the glass shattered. Nate, last night was amazing. I've never felt a connection like this with anyone, not even her. Simone, we can't do this forever, Nate. It's killing me to look at her. Nate, I don't want forever with her. I want forever with you. Just hold on. The words, not even her, felt like a physical blow to my solar plexus. I had spent 3 years building a life with this man, and he was dismissing it as a secondary thought to my own sister. Then came the photos. They weren't the kind of photos you'd find on a burner phone. They weren't explicit. In some ways, they were worse. They were intimate. One was a selfie of them on my couch, the charcoal gray sectional I had spent 3 months picking out. Simone's head was resting on his shoulder, her eyes closed in a way I hadn't seen since we were children. Nate was looking at the camera with a smile that was so full of genuine adoration, it made my stomach turn. In another photo, they were at the lake cabin, the one Simone told me she was visiting alone to clear her head. There they were, holding hands in front of the sunset, looking like the lead characters in a romance novel. I dropped the tablet. It clattered onto the hardwood floor, the screen cracking slightly across the middle. I didn't cry, not yet. I just slid down the wall until my back hit the floor, and I sat there in the dark, my ears ringing with the sound of 1,000 broken promises. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a one-time thing fueled by too much wine. This was a parallel life. They had built a world inside of mine, using my trust as the foundation and my love as the camouflage. I looked at the wedding photo on the wall, the one where Simone was holding my bouquet and Nate was holding my hand. I realized then that I wasn't the protagonist of my own life. I was the obstacle in theirs. When I heard Nate's car pull into the driveway, I didn't move. I just picked up the tablet and waited. The brain was done analyzing. It was time for the anchor to drop. The sound of the garage door opening usually signaled the end of my workday, a cue to start dinner or pour a glass of wine. Tonight, it sounded like a heavy iron gate slamming shut on a tomb. I didn't turn on the lights. I stayed on the floor, the cracked tablet glowing in my lap like a piece of radioactive debris. I heard Nate whistling. He was whistling. He walked through the door, tossed his keys on the entry table, the table Simone had helped us pick out, and called out my name in that casual, breezy way that had become a mask for his treachery. "Bev, you home? You wouldn't believe the traffic on the I-95. He walked into the bedroom and stopped. Even in the shadows, I could see the exact moment the oxygen left his lungs. He saw me sitting on the floor. He saw the tablet. "Beverly, what are you doing in the dark?" His voice was shaky, a thin veil over a rising tide of panic. I didn't answer. I simply slid the tablet across the hardwood floor. It skittered and spun, stopping inches from his polished work shoes. The screen flickered, displaying the photo of him and my sister at the lake cabin, the one where they looked like the only 2 people left on Earth. Nate looked down. Then he looked at me. His face didn't just go pale, it went gray. It was the color of ash. "I can explain," he whispered. I let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound that had no joy in it. "Explain what, Nate? Explain the heart emojis? Explain the 'I miss you' texts sent from our kitchen while I was at work? Or maybe you want to explain the connection you have with my sister that you never felt with me." He started to move toward me, his hands reaching out as if to steady a falling building. "Bev, please, it isn't what it looks like. We both felt so lonely and it just happened. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" I stood up then. My legs felt like lead, but my mind was a razor. A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk. A mistake is a typo in a report. You didn't accidentally spend a year sleeping with my sister. You didn't accidentally take her to the lake and tell her you wanted forever with her. You chose this. Every day, every text, every lie you told me when you kissed me goodbye was a choice to destroy me." He started to cry, actual heavy tears. To anyone else, it might have looked like remorse. To me, the analytical brain, it looked like the pathetic whimpering of a man who had finally been caught in a cage of his own making. "I love you, Beverly. I do. But with Simone, it's different. She understands the parts of me that you—" "Don't you dare," I cut him off. My voice was a whip. "Don't you dare blame my lack of understanding for your lack of character. You didn't go to her because I didn't understand you. You went to her because she was easy, because she was right there, because you knew it was the one thing that would hurt me the most." "I'll cut her off," he pleaded, dropping to his knees. "I'll never speak to her again. We can go to therapy. We can fix this, Bev. You're my wife." I looked at him, this man who had shared my bed and my dreams, and I felt a profound sense of revulsion. He wasn't the steady Nate I had married. He was a stranger wearing my husband's skin. "You're right, Nate. I am your wife," I said. My voice dropped to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "And that's why you have 20 minutes to get out of my house. Take your clothes, take your laptop, but if you touch one thing that belongs to us, one memory, one photo, I will make the next few months of your life a living hell. Do you understand?" "Beverly, please." 19 minutes, I said, checking my watch. I walked out of the room and went to the kitchen. I stood at the sink and ran the cold water over my wrists, trying to lower the temperature of my blood. I heard him frantically throwing things into a suitcase. I heard the drawers slamming. I heard the front door open and close. And then, silence. The house was mine again. But as I stood there in the quiet, I realized that the house was just a box of wood and nails. The home was gone. My husband was gone. And my sister, my protector, she was the one who had handed him the matches. I picked up my phone. I didn't call her, not yet. I just stared at her contact photo, a picture of us at the beach, smiling. I deleted the photo. Then I sat down and waited for the morning. I knew the sun would rise, but the light wouldn't bring warmth. It would only reveal the full extent of the wreckage. The fight for my house was over, but the war for my life was only beginning. They say that blood is thicker than water, but they forget that blood is also easier to spill. After I kicked Nate out, the house didn't feel empty. It felt haunted. Every corner held a memory that had been weaponized against me. I spent the first night sitting in the dark, watching the headlights of passing cars sweep across the ceiling like searchlights looking for a fugitive. I wasn't the fugitive, but I felt like I was hiding, waiting for the second shoe to drop. I knew Simone would come. She was the heart, remember? She couldn't stand a vacuum. She needed to be the one to fix things, to spin the narrative until she was the tragic hero of her own betrayal. 3 days. That's how long it took for her to find the courage to show up. I was sitting at the dining room table, the same table where we'd shared 1,000 meals, where we'd toasted to my wedding, where we'd promised to be each other's North Star. When the doorbell rang, I didn't jump. I didn't even flinch. I just stood up, smoothed my hair, and opened the door. There she was, my blood, my best friend. She was holding a bag of takeout, the spicy noodles from the place we used to go to when we were kids. It was a peace offering wrapped in grease and nostalgia. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her makeup perfectly smudged to show effortless grief. She looked like the victim. "Beverly, I brought your favorite," she whispered. Her voice was small, fragile. I didn't say a word. I just stepped back and let her in. She walked into the kitchen, her eyes darting around the room, looking for signs of Nate. When she saw the space on the counter where his keys usually sat, empty, she let out a breath that sounded like a sob. She set the food down, her hands shaking. "I heard," she said, her back to me. "Nate called me. He told me you found out." I leaned against a doorframe, crossing my arms. I watched her the way a biologist watches a specimen under a lens. "He called you? How touching. Did he call you from the hotel room I paid for, or from the car I helped him buy?" She turned around, the tears finally spilling over. "Beverly, please, you have to understand. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. We tried to stop. We really did. But the more we fought it, the more we realized that we were soulmates." The word soulmates hit the air like a foul odor. "Soulmates," I repeated. My voice was a flat line. "That's a very convenient word for two people who decided to pillage my life for their own entertainment. Tell me, Simone, when did your soul decide it needed my husband? Was it during my wedding? Was it when I was at the hospital after my miscarriage? Or was it during those Tuesdays when I was working 60 hours a week to make sure our family was secure?" "It wasn't like that," she cried, stepping toward me. "He was lonely, Bev. You're always so cold, so analytical. You're the brain, remember? You don't need people the way we do. He felt like he was just a line item in your budget. I gave him a place to feel alive." I felt the bile rise in my throat, but I didn't let my face change. This was the sister's shadow, the way she had always used my strength as a reason to justify her own weakness. Because I was strong, it was okay to hurt me. Because I was capable, I didn't need loyalty. "And you, Simone, what did you need, besides a man who was already taken by your own sister?" She looked down at her hands. "I just wanted to be loved the way he loves you. But then I realized he didn't love you like that. He was just performing for you. With me, he's real." I walked over to the table and sat down. I looked at the spicy noodles, still rising from the container. I realized in that moment that the woman standing in front of me wasn't the sister who had held my hand in the dark when we were kids. That girl was dead. This was a stranger wearing her face, a parasite that had grown fat on my trust. "You know, Simone," I said, my voice dropping to that hushed, terrifyingly calm register, "I spent my whole life protecting you. I stood in front of you so you wouldn't get hit. I worked 2 jobs so you could finish school. I thought that was love. But I see now that I wasn't protecting you from the world. I was protecting the world from you." The color drained from her face. "Beverly, don't say that. We're sisters. We're blood." "Blood is just a liquid. Trust is the only thing that makes it a family. And you've bled me dry." I stood up and pointed to the door. I didn't yell. I didn't throw the noodles. I just waited. "Leave," I said. "Beverly, please. Nate and I want to make this right. We want you to be part of our lives eventually. We don't want to lose you." I looked at her, and for the first time since I'd found that tablet, I felt a flicker of something other than pain. It was clarity, a cold, hard light that showed me exactly what needed to happen next. "You know, Simone," I said, "you've already lost me. You just haven't realized how much that's going to cost you yet." She left, sobbing into her hands, leaving the bag of noodles on the table. I didn't throw them away. I let them sit there until they got cold and the oil congealed. I sat in the silence of my kitchen and realized that the analytical brain had seen enough. The anchor had been cut. It was time to stop being a sister and start being an architect. The war wasn't just about a house or a husband anymore. It was about the legacy of a lie. And I was going to make sure that by the time I was through, the word soulmate would be the only thing they had to eat. For the first 48 hours after Simone walked out of my kitchen, I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't even sleep. Instead, I sat in my home office with the door locked, the glow of 2 monitors illuminating the dark circles under my eyes. If Nate and Simone thought they had left me broken, they had forgotten one crucial detail. I was the one who managed the life budget. I was the one who tracked the miles, filed the taxes, and managed the shared cloud accounts. In my world, everything leaves a footprint. And as I started to dig, I realized their soulmate connection had been paved with my hard-earned money. I started with the credit card statements. I went back 18 months, exporting every line item into a spreadsheet. I highlighted the anomalies in red, the color of debt, the color of a wound. There were the late-night work dinners Nate claimed to have, which conveniently occurred at a high-end bistro 3 blocks from Simone's apartment. There were the gas station charges in towns I'd never visited, towns that just happened to be on the route to that lake cabin. But the real gut punch came when I looked at our shared savings account, the one we had labeled the Forever Fund. It was supposed to be for our first house, a real house with a yard big enough for the kids we talked about having. I watched the balance drop in steady, rhythmic increments over the last year. 500 here, 1,000 there. Nate had been siphoning off our future to fund his present with my sister. He had bought her a designer handbag for her birthday, the same one I had pointed out in a magazine months ago. He had paid her rent twice when she lost her job, a job loss I now realized was likely due to her spending too much time on the phone with my husband. I sat back in my chair, the spreadsheet reflecting in my glasses. It was a map of a heist. They hadn't just stolen my peace, they had been pickpocketing my security while I slept beside them. Analytical, Nate had called me. Cold, Simone had said. I looked at the red lines on the screen and felt a coldness settle into my bones that had nothing to do with the thermostat. If they wanted the brain, I was going to give it to them. I was going to give it to them until they begged for the heart back. I picked up the phone and called a man I'd worked with years ago, a forensic accountant named Marcus Bourne. He was the kind of man who found joy in the decimal point, a man who could find a hidden dollar in a haystack of debt. "Marcus," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand, "I need you to look at some files. I don't want a summary. I want an autopsy." "Beverly, everything okay?" "No," I replied, staring at a photo of Simone on my second monitor, a photo Nate had taken of her wearing my favorite silk robe in a hotel room I had paid for. "But it's about to be very clear. I need to know exactly how much of my life they've spent, every cent, every mile, every lie." As Marcus began his work, I started my own administrative cleanup. I changed the passwords to the streaming services. I removed Nate from the car insurance. I called the bank and froze the shared accounts, moving my half, and only my half, to a private account he couldn't touch. Then I did something that felt like pulling a trigger. I opened our shared cloud photo library. I didn't delete the photos of them, I downloaded them. I organized them by date, location, and cost. I created a folder and titled it Exhibits. By the time the sun started to peek through the blinds on Thursday morning, I wasn't the grieving wife anymore. I was the architect of a collapse. Nate and Simone thought they were living in a romance novel, but I was about to remind them that they were actually living in a contract. And in my world, when you breach a contract, you pay the penalty. I looked at the Forever Fund balance, now a hollowed-out shell of what it once was, and I made a vow. They wanted to be together, fine, but they were going to start their forever the same way Simone and I started our childhood, in the dark, with nothing but ramen noodles and the sound of the debt collector knocking on the door. The paper trail was long, but it led straight to their front door, and I was just getting started. In the world of corporate administration, there is a saying, the paper trail is the only truth that survives the fire. I spent the next week at the office living a double life. To my colleagues, I was the same Beverly, efficient, poised, the woman who kept the gears of the firm turning. But beneath that calm exterior, I was a digital ghost. Now that Marcus Thorne was dissecting our personal finances, I turned my analytical gaze toward the one place where Nate and Simone felt most invincible, their professional lives. Nate was a senior systems analyst at a tech firm that often collaborated with my marketing agency. Simone, ironically, worked as a brand integrity consultant for a local startup. The irony was so thick I could nearly choke on it. I started by pulling the expense reports for the cross-company mixers we had hosted over the last year. As the senior coordinator, I had access to the master logs. I wasn't looking for love anymore. I was looking for fraud. And I found it. On 3 separate occasions, Nate had billed his company for client dinners at the same bistro I'd found on our personal credit card statements. But here was the kicker. The clients he listed were employees from my firm. One of those names was Simone. They weren't just using my forever fund to finance their affair. They were using their corporate expense accounts to subsidize their trysts. They were double-dipping into the pockets of the people who signed their paychecks. I sat back in my office chair, the hum of the air conditioner feeling like a low-frequency warning. I realized then that their betrayal wasn't just a lapse in judgment or a soulmate connection. It was a pattern of entitlement. They believed they were smarter than the systems that supported them. They believed that because I was the reliable one, I would be too busy maintaining the status quo to notice the foundation crumbling beneath us. "Everything all right, Beverly?" I jumped slightly. It was my boss, Diane. She was leaning against the doorframe, a cup of coffee in her hand. She had always been a mentor to me, a woman who valued results over excuses. "Just auditing some year-end reports, Diane," I said, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Found some inconsistencies." Diane narrowed her eyes. She knew that inconsistencies in my vocabulary meant disaster. "Is it something we need to escalate to compliance?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave. I looked at the screen, at the line item where Nate had billed a $200 bottle of wine to a strategy meeting with my sister. I could have ended it right there. I could have handed the file to Diane and watched the dominoes fall. Nate would be fired for expense fraud. Simone's reputation as a brand integrity expert would be incinerated before lunch. But I hesitated. The analytical brain told me that if I struck now, I would be seen as the scorned wife seeking petty revenge. I would lose the high ground. In the corporate world, timing isn't just everything, it's the only thing. If I wanted them to feel the full weight of their choices, I couldn't just get them fired. I had to let them think they were getting away with it until the very moment the floor disappeared. "Not yet," I told Diane, forcing a smile that felt like a mask. "I need to verify a few more entries. I'll have a full report for you by the end of the month." Diane nodded, satisfied. "I trust your judgment, Bev. You've never let a detail slip through the cracks." As she walked away, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. She was right. I don't let things slip. I spent the rest of the afternoon creating a new folder on my encrypted drive. I didn't call it Exhibits this time. I called it The Audit. Inside, I placed the cross-referenced expense reports, the timestamps of Nate's on-call hours that matched perfectly with Simone's social media check-ins, and the emails they'd sent through the company server.
emails they thought were private, but which lived forever on the back-end logs I knew how to navigate. They were living in a shadow, thinking the darkness would protect them, but they forgot that I was the one who controlled the lights. As I left the office that night, I walked past Simone's building. I saw her through the glass of the lobby, laughing with a coworker, looking vibrant and untouched by the wreckage she'd caused. She looked like she was winning. I tightened my grip on my briefcase and kept walking. Let her laugh. Let her believe she had stolen the heart of my life. She had no idea that the brain was already calculating the cost of her soul. The corporate shadow was growing long, and by the time it reached them, there would be nowhere left to hide.
There's a specific kind of bravery required to walk into a room full of people who know your husband is sleeping with your sister while you pretend you're just there for the appetizers. The occasion was Sarah's engagement party. Sarah had been our mutual friend since college, the kind of friend who hated drama but lived for the gossip. I knew Nate and Simone would be there. I knew they would try to use the event as their coming-out party, a way to test the waters and see if the social circle would accept their soulmate narrative. I spent 2 hours on my makeup, not to look pretty, but to look untouchable. I chose a dress the color of obsidian, sharp lines, cold fabric. I wasn't the grieving wife anymore. I was a statue. When I walked into the rooftop lounge, the conversation didn't stop, but it stuttered. You could hear the gears of a dozen minds shifting as they tried to figure out the etiquette for greeting a woman whose life had been set on fire by the 2 people standing near the bar. And there they were. Nate was wearing the blue linen shirt I had bought him for our last anniversary. Simone was tucked under his arm, her hand resting on his chest in a way that screamed possession. They looked vibrant. They looked happy. They looked like a lie that had finally convinced itself it was the truth. "Beverly, you made it," Sarah chirped, her eyes darting between me and the bar. She was terrified of a scene. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, Sarah," I said, my voice smooth and level. "It's a night for celebrating commitments, isn't it?" I walked straight toward the bar. I didn't avoid them. I didn't flinch. I walked right into their personal space. Nate froze, his drink halfway to his mouth. Simone's grip on his arm tightened so hard her knuckles went white. "Nate, Simone," I nodded, my voice as cold as the ice in my glass. "Bev," he stammered, "we didn't think. I mean, we're glad you're here." "I'm sure you are," I said, taking a slow sip of my drink while staring directly into Simone's eyes. "It must be exhausting having to hide in lake cabins and dark kitchens. It's much more efficient to do this in the light, don't you think?" Simone straightened her back, trying to summon that heart persona she used to manipulate everyone. "Beverly, we don't want this to be awkward. We're all adults. We've moved on. We just want everyone to be happy." I looked at her, the sister who had shared my bed as a child, the sister I had fed and protected. I saw the greed in her eyes, the desperate need to be the center of attention, even if that attention was born of a wound. "Happy?" I whispered, leaning in so only the 2 of them could hear me. "Is that what you call this? You think because you're standing in a room full of people who are too polite to spit on you, you've won? You're not soulmates, Simone. You're accomplices. And the problem with accomplices is that eventually the bill comes due." Nate tried to interject, his steady voice cracking. "Bev, you're making people uncomfortable." "No, Nate," I said, stepping back and flashing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Your presence is making them uncomfortable. I'm just the one pointing out the smell." I spent the rest of the night being the perfect guest. I laughed at jokes, I toasted the couple, I acted as if the 2 people huddled in the corner like guilty children didn't exist. I watched as our friends, people who had once toasted to my marriage, gradually gravitated away from Nate and Simone.
People can ignore a private betrayal, but a public one makes them feel dirty. By the time the cake was cut, Nate and Simone were standing in a small, lonely circle of their own making. They thought they were showing the world their new love. Instead, they were showing the world their character. As I left, I caught Simone's reflection in the glass of the elevator. She looked tired. The mask was slipping. She was realizing that the vibrant life she wanted required an audience that no longer wanted to watch. I drove home in the quiet, the obsidian dress crinkling against the seat. I didn't feel happy, but I felt prepared. The public mask had served its purpose. I had seen their weakness. They needed validation. They needed to be blessed in the eyes of others. I pulled into my driveway and looked at the dark windows of my townhouse. I knew Marcus Torn would have the final audit ready by morning. The stage was set, the audience was primed, and the bill I mentioned to Simone, it was about to be hand-delivered. The theater was over. Now the real work began.
In surgery, to cauterize is to burn the flesh to stop the bleeding. It's painful, it's violent, but it's the only way to ensure the patient doesn't bleed out on the table. That morning, as I sat in the glass-walled office of my attorney, Elias Thorne, I was ready for the burn. Elias didn't look like a shark. He looked like a grandfatherly librarian, soft-spoken, wearing a cardigan that smelled of cedar and old paper. But on the mahogany desk between us sat the autopsy provided by Marcus Thorne. It was 300 pages of red ink and betrayal. "Beverly," Elias said, his voice as smooth as polished stone, "I've seen a lot of infidelity cases. Usually it's a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment. But this," he tapped the file, "this is a coordinated liquidation of your marital assets to fund a third party. And the fact that the third party is your sister, well, that changes the temperature of the room." I leaned back, my hands folded in my lap. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted math. "Tell me the numbers, Elias." "Nate didn't just spend the savings," Elias began, sliding a summary sheet toward me. "He channeled funds through a shell PayPal account. He used your shared equity line of credit to pay for consulting fees that went directly to Simone's personal account. In total, he's moved nearly $85,000 of marital property into her hands over the last 14 months. I stared at the number. $85,000. That was the house with the yard. That was the forever we had talked about. Every time he had kissed my forehead and told me he was proud of my hard work, he was mentally calculating how much of that work he could hand over to my sister. "What are our options?" I asked. Elias smiled, and for the first time I saw the shark beneath the cardigan. "In this state, we have alienation of affection laws that are rarely used, but given the financial fraud, we aren't just going for a divorce, we're going for restitution. I want to claw back every cent he gave her. I want his 401k to cover the Forever Fund, and since he used company resources to facilitate the affair, he's in breach of his own employment contract's morality and ethics clause." "He doesn't know about the audit yet," I whispered. "Good. We don't want him to know until the process server knocks. But Beverly, you need to understand something. Once we pull this trigger, there is no going back. You won't just be divorcing your husband. You will be legally dismantling your sister's life. She will be named as a co-respondent in a fraud investigation. Her brand integrity career will be over before the ink is dry." I thought about the ramen noodles. I thought about the flashlights in the dark. I thought about the girl who held my hand in the bed when I was 10 years old. Then I thought about the photo of her in my silk robe laughing in a hotel room I paid for. "She chose her side of the bed, Elias," I said. My voice dropped to that hushed intensity. "I'm just the one turning on the lights." "Very well," Elias said, pulling a fountain pen from his pocket. "Sign here and here." As I signed the documents, I felt a strange sensation. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even relief. It was a cold, clinical satisfaction.
I was no longer the anchor being dragged down. I was the icebreaker cutting through the frozen waste. Nate and Simone thought they were starting a new chapter of a romance. They didn't realize they were actually entering the discovery phase of a lawsuit. They were still playing house, while I was playing for keeps. When I walked out of the office, the sun was blindingly bright. I put on my sunglasses and took a deep breath. The bleeding had stopped. The cauterization was complete. Now all that was left was to watch the fire I had started burn through the lies until only the truth remained. The bill was finally being tallied, and I was going to make sure they paid for every single cent.
Most people think the end of a life happens with a scream. It doesn't. It happens with a knock on the door at 7:15 in the morning. I was sitting in my kitchen, sipping black coffee, when the process server I hired, a man who looked as ordinary as a mailman, stepped onto the porch of the love nest Nate and Simone had rented together. I wasn't there to see it, but I didn't need to be. I had the administrative timeline in my head. 7:16 a.m. Nate opens the door in his boxers, expecting the morning paper. Instead, he's handed a thick blue envelope, the petition for divorce, the temporary restraining order on all shared assets, and the notice of discovery, a legal demand for every text, every email, and every bank statement he thought he'd deleted. 8:30 a.m., Nate arrives at work. He thinks he can hide in his cubicle and figure out a plan. But Elias Thorne has already sent a courtesy copy of the financial audit to the compliance department of Nate's firm. By 9 a.m., Nate isn't looking at spreadsheets. He's being escorted out of the building by security for gross financial misconduct and expense fraud. 10 a.m., it's Simone's turn. She was at a brand integrity conference, probably prepared to speak about the importance of authenticity. She was served right in the middle of the lobby, not just with the divorce papers naming her as a co-respondent, but with a civil suit for fraudulent transfer of assets, $85,000 worth of suit. I watched the fallout from my office, my phone vibrating with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. Nate, voicemail 1, Beverly, what the hell is this? You're trying to ruin me. I lost my job. They took my badge, Bev. Call me. Simone, text, how could you do this? We're family. You're suing your own sister? I don't have that money, Beverly. It's gone. I didn't reply. I didn't even listen to the full messages. I just saved them to the exhibits folder. The most beautiful part of the analytical brain is that it doesn't get distracted by noise. I knew exactly where that money went. It went into the designer bags, the weekend trips, and the expensive dinners they used to toast my coldness. By noon, the soulmate fantasy was meeting the cold, hard reality. Nate was jobless, Simone was a legal liability, and for the first time in a year, they weren't looking at each other with stars in their eyes. They were looking at each other and seeing a bill they couldn't pay. Nate called one last time that evening. His voice wasn't angry anymore. It was broken. Bev, please. I have nowhere to go. My accounts are frozen. I'm at a motel. Just talk to me. I looked out my window at the garden I had finally managed to keep alive. You told Simone I was the anchor that dragged you down, Nate. I'm not the anchor anymore. I'm the ocean. And you, Nate, are just a man who forgot how to swim. I hung up. The unraveling was happening exactly as Elias and Marcus Thorne had predicted. The soulmates were discovering that when you build a house out of stolen wood, it doesn't take much for the whole thing to come crashing down. The silence in my house used to feel lonely. Now, it sounded like victory. There's a specific kind of silence that follows a disaster. The kind you hear after the sirens stop, but before the cleanup begins. My life was quiet now. The legal machinery set in motion by the Thorne brothers was grinding Nate and Simone into dust behind the scenes, leaving me to sit in my quiet townhouse and breathe for the first time in years. Then came the knock. It wasn't the aggressive, panicked pounding of a man like Nate. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching. I knew who it was before I even reached the door. I opened it to find Simone. She didn't look like the brand integrity consultant anymore. She didn't look like the heart of the room. Her hair was unwashed, her eyes were sunken, and she was wearing an old sweater of mine she'd never returned, a physical reminder of the life she'd stolen. "Beverly," she whispered, "please, I have nowhere else to go." I didn't move from the doorway. I stood there like a sentinel. "Where's your soulmate, Simone? I thought the two of you were building a forever together." She let out a ragged, ugly sob. "He's gone. As soon as the accounts were frozen and the job loss hit, he changed. He blamed me. He said I was the one who pushed him to take the money. We haven't stopped screaming at each other for 3 days. He left this morning to go stay on a friend's couch." I watched her, waiting for the old Beverly, the protector, to feel a pang of sympathy. I waited for my heart to soften at the sight of my baby sister in pain. But there was nothing, just a cold, empty space where my loyalty used to live. So the forever lasted exactly 72 hours after the money ran out. That has to be a new record for soulmates. "Beverly, please," she cried, reaching out to touch my arm. I stepped back as if her hand were a hot iron. "The lawyers, they're saying I'm liable for the fraud too. They're going to take everything I have. I'll be homeless. You're my sister. You can't let this happen to me. Just tell your lawyer to drop the suit against me. Punish Nate. He's the one who owed you the vows, not me." I leaned against the doorframe, looking at her with a clinical, detached curiosity. "You're right, Simone. Nate owed me the marriage vows, but you owed me something much older. You owed me the 20 years of ramen noodles and flashlights. You owed me for every time I stood between you and a world that wanted to break you. You didn't just break a contract. You murdered a history." "I made a mistake," she shrieked, her face contorting. "I was lonely. I just wanted to feel special." "You were special," I said, my voice dropping to that terrifying, hushed whisper. "You were the only person in the world I would have died for. But you weren't satisfied being my sister. You wanted to be my replacement. And the cost of being me is that you have to handle the fallout when things go wrong. Well, Simone, things have gone very, very wrong." I started to close the door. "Beverly, if you do this, I will never speak to you again. You'll be alone. Is that what you want? To be right but be alone?" I paused, the door inches from the frame. I looked her in the eyes one last time. "I was alone the moment you stepped into my kitchen behind my back. The only difference is, now I don't have to pay for the privilege of your company." I clicked the lock. I heard her slide down the door, sobbing, begging, and then, finally, cursing my name. She called me a monster. She called me cold. She called me the brain. I went to my kitchen, poured a glass of water, and watched the clock. The last tie was severed. The sister's shadow was gone. There were no more face-offs, no more pleas, just the final execution of the plan. Tomorrow, the final papers would be served. Tomorrow, the audit would become a judgment. Tomorrow, I would finally be clean. They say that the best revenge is living well, but I think they're wrong. The best revenge is living independently. It's been 18 months since the day the Forever Fund turned into a legal battleground. The dust hasn't just settled, it's been swept away. Nate is gone. Last I heard, he was working an entry-level tech support job 3 states away, half of his paycheck garnished every month to pay back the restitution he owes me. The steady Nate I loved never existed. He was just a man who didn't know how to be alone, and now he has no choice. Simone, we haven't spoken since the night she sat on my porch and called me a monster. Her brand integrity career ended the moment the civil suit hit the public records. She's working retail now, living in a cramped studio apartment, still posting soulmate quotes on a social media account that no one follows anymore. She still doesn't understand that the heart is useless if it doesn't have a conscience to guide it. As for me, I didn't stay in that townhouse. I didn't want to live in a museum of my own betrayal. I sold it, took my half of the equity, plus the clawed-back $85,000, and moved to a city where the air feels different. I have a new apartment. It's smaller, but every single item in it belongs to me. I picked the furniture, I picked the colors, and most importantly, I kept the succulents alive. My life isn't a romance novel. It's not a thriller anymore either. It's a quiet, well-managed, analytical life. I still work as a senior coordinator, but now I coordinate my own happiness. I've started going to therapy, not to fix myself, but to learn how to trust my own instincts again. I realized that my brain wasn't cold. It was my survival mechanism. It was the part of me that knew the truth before my heart was ready to hear it. I don't hate them anymore. Hatred requires energy, and I'm too busy building a future to waste any on the past. Sometimes, late at night, I think about those 2 little girls sitting in the dark with flashlights. I mourn for them. I mourn for the sisterhood I thought was a fortress. But I also realized that the person I was protecting back then wasn't Simone. It was the idea of family. Now, I am my own family. I am my own anchor. And for the first time in my life, I don't feel like I'm being dragged down. I feel like I'm finally anchored to something real. Myself. My name is Beverly Carter. I was betrayed by the people I trusted most. They tried to burn my world down, but they forgot one thing. I'm the one who knows where the fire extinguishers are kept. I survived, I rebuilt, and I am whole. Betrayal is a wound that changes your DNA. It makes you question everything, your past, your judgment, and even your future. But as Beverly's story shows us, the end of a relationship isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning of your rise. If Beverly's journey through the fire touched your heart today, or if you've ever looked into the eyes of someone you loved and realized they were wearing a mask, you are not alone. This community is a place for the survivors, the architects, and the ones who refuse to stay broken. In the comments below, tell me, what was the moment of clarity for you? When did your analytical brain finally tell you it was time to turn on the lights? We want to hear your stories of resilience. If you found strength in this video, please like and share it. Your support helps us bring more of these raw, real-life accounts of trust and betrayal to light. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss our next chapter. Remember, your story doesn't end at betrayal. It begins with your rise. This has been Echoes of Trust and Betrayal. Thank you for listening. Until next time, keep your eyes open.